and welcome back to Voyage of a Time Wanderer. Today I am here to share my Victober TBR for 2025. So I know it has been quite a while since I last posted a video on this channel. I'm sorry for the kind of unannounced break. I ended up taking a bit of a pause from all things social media since the beginning of the year, really. I couldn't let Victober go by without making at least a Victober TBR, especially because it is the 10th Victober, so this is the 10th anniversary of the starting of Victober. And there are lots of kind of extra special things about Victober 10, so I had to take part. I actually first got involved with Victober kind of halfway through 2016, so this will be my 9th Victober. I missed out on the first year, but I'm still so excited to celebrate a decade of Victober goodness. One of the special things that they are doing to celebrate 10 years of Victober is having 10 hosts and 10 prompts. So this year, Victober is being hosted by Katie from Books and Things, Kate Howe, Marissa from Blatantly Bookish, Roz from Skelly Dandling About the Books, and then they've also brought in Elizabeth from A Literary Princess, Hannah from Hannah's Books, Jess from Dickens and Docs, Milena from Milena Reads, Roy from Roy Reads Anything, and Catherine from Taking Tea with Catherine. So it's very exciting to have this big panel of hosts this year and to have so many prompts to help guide my TBR. Since there are 10 prompts this year, I did try to be a little creative in having some books do double duty, as well as trying to have some shorter works and kind of like non-novel items on my TBR just to try to make it a little bit more manageable. And I also tried to build a fairly audiobook heavy TBR. I have actually ended up being on strike right now, and it's looking like it's not going to be resolved kind of in the immediate future, so I probably have at least another week or two or maybe more of walking the picket line, and I have like a lot of dedicated time per day when I could be just listening to audiobooks when I don't feel like kind of making small talk. So definitely trying to have lots of audiobooks for this kind of unique circumstance this year. On kind of a side note, if any of you have any really good recommendations, I know lots of Victorian literature deals with kind of working conditions, and I thought it would be kind of neat to read a book where characters go on strike. I feel like there was a strike in North and South and Shirley, which I have both read, but if you know kind of any other titles where a strike is featured, maybe that will get added onto my TBR if I finish up the audiobooks that I have. So without further ado, let me get into my TBR. So Kate's challenge is to read a Victorian book where friendship is featured. And so for that, as soon as I thought of Victorian literature and friendship, there's only one duo that is very near to my heart that I wanted to reread a title from, and that is, of course, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. And so I am planning to reread The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This book was actually one of two books that I read for my very first Victober, so I thought it was very fitting to do a reread of it for this kind of anniversary Victober. So I last read this book 9 years ago, and I'm pretty sure it's still like in my top 5 Victorian books, like in my ranking, but I've never reread it. And so I thought after 9 years and claiming this as one of my like all-time favorite Victorian novels, this would be a perfect reread. This is one of the standalone novels in the Sherlock Holmes series, so it's not a short story collection. And in this, Watson gets sent to this estate house where there is rumors of this kind of ghoulish supernatural hound that is haunting the neighborhood. And that is what he's called to investigate after Sir Baskerville dies suddenly in this estate, and his death is being blamed on this mythical hound that claims to have been haunting his family for generations. And so it's very atmospheric, very gothic. I remember it being a pretty quick read, and of course I just love a Sherlock Holmes mystery. Then Katie's challenge is to read a work of Victorian literature that's not a novel. And you'll see that later on I have a couple of poems on my TBR, which will also be kind of double counting for this. So for my main pick for this challenge, I'm going back to a book that you'll have seen on, I think, my last 2 or maybe my last 3 Victober TBRs, and that is my collection of sermons, prayers, and devotions by St. John Cardinal Newman. He's actually being declared a Doctor of the Church on November 1st, and so it's definitely even more apropos to read some of his works. I've been very slowly working through this collection of sermons over the last few Victobers, and again, I'm not planning to finish this book this year. It's one that I am just slowly working through. He was a Victorian era scholar, originally an Anglican priest who later converted to Catholicism and eventually became a cardinal. He wrote quite extensively, and I find his sermons are very beautiful, but definitely very dense, so I'll probably pick up like one a week maybe. And this volume will probably see me through another decade of Victobers when I keep going through it so slowly, but I really enjoy taking my time with his sermons and kind of savoring and reflecting on them as I read. Then Marissa's challenge is to read a work of Victorian literature where a character experiences a change in class status or social mobility. So like Rags to Riches or Fallen Woman were the two examples. And for this prompt, I have a book that I had never heard of, but it came up randomly for me on Goodreads one day. I was like thinking about how much I had enjoyed The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnim, and like just looking at the Goodreads page for it and wishing there was other books that were kind of similar. And this popped up as one of those like readers also enjoyed suggestions. And I've never heard of it before, and that is Miss Cayley's Adventures by Grant Allen. It sounds like the plot is kind of Around the World in 80 Days mashed with Mary Barton a little bit, which definitely sounds like something I might really enjoy. So the premise is that Miss Cayley's stepfather, who she never met, she was away at kind of like finishing school on the continent. Her mother remarried this stepfather who immediately wasted the entire family fortune, and so when her stepfather dies, she is left with only a twopence in her pocket. Undaunted, the intelligent, attractive, and infinitely resourceful young woman decides to set off in search of adventure. Her travels take her from London to Germany, Italy, Egypt, and India, as she faces various challenges and meets an assortment of eccentric characters. But when her true love, Harold Tillington, finds himself accused of forging a will and faces prison, Miss Cayley will need all her ingenuity to investigate the case, solve the mystery, and save Harold from the diabolical plot. So it just sounds like a lot of fun. It's like an amateur female Victorian detective who's traveling around the world with a little bit of like a romance plot thrown in. I'm hoping it's as fun as it sounds. I've never heard of anyone that I know of reading this book, and when I look on Goodreads, like no one I know has read it, but it does have a 3.8 rating, so fairly respectable. So I am excited about that. It is available on audiobook through LibriVox. This is going to be my main pick for the change in class circumstances prompt, since she obviously grew up wealthy and kind of with an expectation of a certain standard of living, and then has to make her own way in the world after her stepfather has squandered her inheritance. It also is going to be my pick for Milena's prompt, which was to spin a digital color wheel and pick a Victorian book with a cover that is primarily that color. And when I spun my color wheel, I ended up with green, and the cover for Miss Cayley's Adventure also features a lot of green, and so that is doing double duty with those two prompts. I think it's also probably going to be the main book where I find pieces of evidence, I guess, for Roz's challenge, which is empire spotting. See how many times you can spot signs of empire in your Victober reading. Obviously, this mentions that she travels fairly extensively, including to some countries like India that were part of the British Empire at the time. So I think this is going to be one where I really see signs of empire everywhere, but I will also be keeping my eye out throughout the rest of the books I read to see what else I notice. Then Elizabeth's prompt is to read a work by an underrated Victorian woman writer, and for this I am going back to an author that I read for the first time last October, and it ended up being one of my favorite books of the year, and that is Josephine Ward. I read One Poor Scruple last year, absolutely loved it, and that was her debut work. And so I'm going to read her second novel, which is The Light Behind, this year. I think it was actually published in 1903, but it looks like maybe like February 1903, so that's technically after Queen Victoria died. But I am counting it anyway because she obviously would have been writing it through the last few years of Queen Victoria's reign, so it was written during the Victorian period. Even if it was published just in the first few years of the Edwardian era, it's a little bit of a cheat but she is still a Victorian female author. I can find really no information about this book. It is out of print. It looks like I think only One Per Scruple has been like republished fairly recently. The rest of her work is quite hard to find. I did find one scanned copy through like a university library that had free access. And so I'm going in fairly blind. So I'm going in pretty blind, but I'm hoping I'm going to enjoy it since I liked her other book so much. I'm assuming it will have kind of similar themes, focusing around the character's Catholic faith and maybe some kind of upper class aristocratic families. I don't know, I'm guessing. It doesn't, like, none of the editions that I can see online have like a blurb or anything, so I really don't know. I started to read the first page, it looked excellent, and so I will just see how I enjoy it once Victober starts. And then Hannah's challenge is to read a Victorian work that discusses education. And for this, I'm going with another book that has been on like my Victober TBR or my like classics to read list for quite a few years now, and that is The Professor by Charlotte Bronte. Obviously the title, The Professor, indicates that it's going to deal fairly extensively with the education system. I'm filming this video on Tuesday, September 30th, and I actually started the very first few chapters yesterday while I was on the picket line because I had finished up my last audiobook and needed something to listen to. So I'm about 5 chapters in so far, and I'm actually really enjoying it. I have literally been putting this book off for so long. I don't know, I read Jane Eyre right at the beginning of my Victorian literature journey and read it really quickly and enjoyed it. And then I read Shirley maybe the next year or two. Whenever it was the Victober group read, I read Shirley. And I found Shirley quite challenging at the time. It's one that I would like to go and reread now that I have a better, I guess, grasp on reading Victorian literature. But I think because I found that book so much of a slog, I kind of got re-intimidated by Charlotte Bronte, and I've been nervous about picking up The Professor and Villette, which are the last 2 that I have to read from her. So I'm pleasantly surprised by how much I've enjoyed the first couple chapters of The Professor so far. And actually, when I started reading this book, I realized that not only does it have to do with education, but it also is a change in class circumstances type story as well, so it's kind of double counting with that prompt. Our main character is a young man called William Crimsworth, and his mother came from an aristocratic background, but was kind of disowned by her family after she married his father, who was a tradesman. And so after he was orphaned, him and his brother received financial assistance from his mother's side of the family to go through their schooling. So he was educated at Eton and was kind of given a taste of this upper class life that his mother's family background was from. And then after he graduates, he's offered a position with a rectory with the provision that he has to marry one of his cousins. And he turns that down. And so at least at the beginning where I am right now, he is having to make his own way in the world without any of the financial backing of his family. The main kind of plot of the story is going to follow him as he begins working in Belgium at a boys' boarding school. It's definitely going to have lots to do with Victorian era education, and I'll be glad to finally be able to cross this off of my kind of like long-term Victorian TBR. Then Jess's challenge is to step back in time, read a Victorian work set in a different era. And kind of as we got into these last couple of prompts, I started to panic about how many books I had scheduled for the month. This was before I realized I was going to be on strike and having extra reading time available every day. So for the next 2 prompts, I picked poetry. So for Jess's challenge, I'm going to be reading The Eve of St. Agnes by John Keats, which is a romantic narrative poem of 42 stanzas set in the Middle Ages. And the whole poem is centered around this old wives' tale or folk tradition at the time that if a young woman did certain things on the eve of the feast of St. Agnes, she would dream about her future husband that night. And like I said, it is set back in the Middle Ages, and I think the whole thing takes place within a castle, so it's definitely very medieval. And it was regarded during the Victorian era as one of Keats's best poems. So I'm looking forward to that quite a bit. So then Roy's challenge is to read a Victorian work of fantasy, and I also went with a poem for this pick, and that is Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti. I am not like the biggest fantasy person, and I'm also reading Lord of the Rings for the first time this year. I've read the first 2 books, and I have a 3rd book to read in November, December. And so I didn't want to start another big work of fantasy that would maybe confuse me while I was in the middle of this epic fantasy story that I've waited so long to read. And so I thought, a poem for this would also be a perfect fit. It is also a narrative poem, and it is the story of two sisters, Laura and Lizzie, who are tempted with fruit by goblin merchants. It sounds like it might be a perfect Halloween read, so I might save it for the end of the month. I've actually never read anything by Christina Rossetti before, although I know she's quite a well-known Victorian author, and so I'm looking forward to finally being introduced to her work through this poem. And then finally, Catherine's challenge is to read a Victorian book that has a connection to Jane Austen. And as soon as I read that prompt, I knew exactly the book that I wanted to read for this. And that is The Younger Sister by Catherine Hubback. Catherine Hubback was Jane Austen's niece, and she published The Younger Sister in 1850, and it's a continuation of The Watsons. And so The Watsons was one of the novels that was still a fragment when Jane Austen passed away. She had begun around 1803 and abandoned for some reason, and so it was never finished. When I read through those first couple of chapters that we still have from what Jane Austen envisioned the beginning of the book being like, it definitely captivated me and was one that I was really sad she never got a chance to finish. And so I think it would be really interesting to see how her niece finished this book and kind of completed the storyline. It's said that the first couple of chapters that we had from Jane Austen aren't like directly copied in the beginning of The Younger Sister. Historians, scholars believe that she probably didn't have access to written copies of the fragments that Jane Austen left. So she was just remembering how the story began from being told it as a young girl. And so there's a few changes that she makes to those beginning chapters, but really the setup of the plot is how Jane Austen had set it up, and then it is finished off by Catherine Hubback. When researching this book and Catherine as an author, I found it quite interesting. She turned to writing novels to try to support her family after her husband was institutionalized after a nervous breakdown. And so she needed to make money quite quickly to be able to support her family, and so she'd never written before. The Younger Sister was the first book that she published, and then in the next 13 years it says that she wrote 9 more novels. So for 13 years she was relying on writing to help support her family. And then in the 1870s she ended up immigrating to California to live with her second son, who had moved there previously. So The Younger Sister was published in 1850, but obviously it is based on the beginning of a story that Jane wrote in the early 1800s that was probably set more in the 1780s or 1790s. So it also kind of works again for Jess's prompt to read a Victorian book set in a different era, because obviously we're going back to more of the Regency or Georgian era to complete the story that Jane Austen began to tell. So those are all my picks for the 10 prompts, and then when I was looking at my TBR, I realized I didn't have an Elizabeth Gaskell, which kind of felt sacrilegious, especially for the 10th Victober. And so I'm also hoping to read Cousin Phyllis by Elizabeth Gaskell, and it centers around a young man called Paul Mannion who moves to the countryside to his mother's family and meets his cousin Phyllis. It is one of Gaskell's works that I haven't read yet, and I know I'm going to enjoy her writing. There's nothing I've read of hers that I haven't enjoyed. I love her cozy, domestic, kind of slice-of-life writing, and so I figured since it is one of her shorter novella-length works, it would be easy to add onto my TBR. I'm hoping to listen to this on audio as well. So that's all that I have planned for my TBR. I am a little bit sad there's no sensation novel on my TBR this year, and so if this strike ends up going longer than I hope, and I have even more audiobook time on my hands that I don't know what to do with, I might pick up a Wilkie Collins, but I haven't decided yet which one I would go with. So if you have a recommendation for which Collins I should read next, I would be happy to hear that. Of his work so far, I have read The Dead Secret, The Moonstone, Man and Wife, The Woman in White, and A House to Let. So if you know of a title that I haven't read yet that has a really good audiobook, I would definitely be interested to hear about that. So those are my reading plans for October and for this 10th edition of Victober. And until next time, enjoy wandering through the pages of a good book. Bye.